When the two are awakened 90 years early from their induced hibernation on a spaceship headed for a distant colony, it sets the stage for a thrilling tale of survival and romance. The Avalon spaceship is traveling through space to a place called Homestead 2. The ship's rooms are all empty, and it's moving itself. Everyone, including the 258 crew members and 5,000 passengers, is sleeping in special beds. While in space, the ship goes through a rocky area that weakens its protective wall. They use more power to protect the ship, but it's about to crash into a huge rock. The crash causes problems on the ship, and it starts fixing itself. One of the special beds opens up, and a man named Jim Preston, who knows about machines, wakes up. An automatic system helps him wake up and tells him he's been asleep for 120 years. They're almost at Homestead 2, and he can enjoy the nice things on the ship. Jim gets instructions about his ID, his room, and what he should do before they get to the planet. He's excited and nervous about meeting others, but when he looks around, he can't find anyone. He tries to ask a hologram about Earth, and it says Earth is too crowded and expensive. It tells him to wait to ask questions, but he keeps asking why he's the only one there. He realizes the hologram can't answer him, so he goes looking for people. He checks different places on the ship, but nobody is there. He tries to talk to the captain, but can't get in. Jim goes to a place to look at stars and figures out they are far from Homestead 2, much farther than he thought. He knows he woke up too early. He goes back to where he started and sends a message to Earth, asking for help to go back to sleep. But it will take 55 years for Earth to answer. Jim is very sad about it. While exploring the ship, Jim eventually stumbles upon the ship's bar and encounters another person. However, he soon notices something peculiar about this person. When Jim goes to get a drink for him, he realizes that the person is not human but an android named Arthur. Jim is eager to learn more but struggles to explain how he woke up prematurely. The next day, he heads to the cantina and discovers that most of the menu items are reserved for gold-class passengers. He settles for a simple coffee and attempts to fix his hibernation pod. Despite his efforts and all the tools he gathers, it remains non-functional. Jim then tries to access the crew's hibernation pods, but his attempts are in vain. The ship experiences minor malfunctions, and Jim frequents the bar, often chatting with Arthur. The android offers some advice that persuades Jim to break into one of the gold-class rooms to enjoy the ship's amenities. Jim explores the ship's restaurants, games, and entertainment system, but over time, his loneliness intensifies. One day, he becomes inebriated and wanders near the hibernation pods, accidentally stumbling into an airlock with spacesuits designed for spacewalks. Jim dons a suit, goes to the airlock, activates it, and opens the airlock door, revealing a mesmerizing view of space outside the ship. Jim finds himself utterly alone in this moment. He decides to float outside in space, unclipping the magnets from his boots, and it leaves him feeling devastated. After re-entering the ship and removing the spacesuit, he returns to the airlock without it. At the airlock, Jim prepares to take a drastic step, pulling the lever as if to end it all, but at the last moment he has a change of heart. He rushes back inside and, in a somewhat comical twist, slips on a bottle. Upon standing up, Jim becomes captivated by one of the hibernation pods, which holds a woman named Aurora. He searches for her information in the ship's directory and listens to her passenger interview, becoming enamored with her. Later, he is shown sitting beside her pod, still engrossed in her recorded interviews. In the ship's bar, he reads some of her work and discusses her writing with Arthur. Jim becomes obsessed with the irony of his situation, embarking on a journey to a new world for a better life, waking up prematurely, and finding his ideal woman, only to have her be beyond his reach. Jim contemplates the idea of waking Aurora from hibernation. He discusses it with the android, but Arthur can't grasp the complexity of the situation. Jim initially decides against it, but as time passes, he finds it increasingly difficult to let go of the idea until one day he changes his mind. Jim goes to Aurora's hibernation pod and successfully activates it. As she begins to wake up, experiencing the same disorienting process he once did, Jim retreats and heads back to his room. A little later, he ventures to the main concourse, hopeful to find her. To his relief, there she is, looking just as bewildered as he did a year ago. Jim explains to Aurora that they are the only ones awake and takes her to the observatory. There, he discloses that he can't access either the crew or the ship's main controls. Aurora becomes distressed and expresses a desire to return to her pod. When they reach it, Jim gently informs her that the ship lacks the necessary equipment to put them back into hibernation, effectively conveying that they are stranded. Returning to the concourse, Jim suggests that she should rest, since she has just emerged from hibernation. Aurora empathizes with his year-long solitude on the ship. Jim, feeling remorseful for what he did, asks Arthur not to reveal that he was the one who woke her. The following day, Aurora awakens, and she heads back to the concourse. She inquires with the automated info desk about the hibernation pods, and Jim joins her. They go for breakfast, and as they leave, the info desk experiences a malfunction. In the cantina, Aurora notices that Jim has been eating the same breakfast for over a year and decides to get him a menu from the gold class section. They discuss the possibility of fixing the pods, but unlike Jim, Aurora isn't ready to give up. She searches through the infirmary, peruses research documents, and ultimately attempts to break into the crew's hibernation quarters. Jim notices more issues cropping up throughout the ship. Later on, Aurora begins to express her discontent with her life on the Avalon. She spends her time writing, jogging around the ship, and swimming in the pool, gradually becoming more aware of the challenging circumstances they find themselves in. Curious about Jim's story, Aurora goes to the cantina to interview him, thinking it might be interesting. Jim initially responds with company slogans but then opens up, sharing his hope for a fresh start on the new world, to build a life for himself. In the observatory, they continue their conversation, and Aurora reveals her reason for being on the ship. Unlike other passengers, she holds a round-trip ticket, intending to visit Homestead 2, live there for a year, and return to Earth to write an extraordinary story, becoming the first journalist to do so. As Aurora gradually lets go of the idea of finding a solution to their predicament, Jim comes up with a plan to lift her spirits. He takes her dancing, to the cinema, and to the basketball court. Their last stop is the bar to meet Arthur. Although Aurora enjoys a brief respite, her situation eventually returns to her thoughts, leaving Jim alone with the android and a heavy burden of guilt. Later, Jim is seen working on something, and in another scene, Aurora walks into the observatory to find a miniature model of the Chrysler building that Jim has crafted for her. At another point, they go on a date at the bar, enjoying dinner and sharing stories about their lives. Aurora reveals that her father passed away when she was a teenager. After their dinner, Jim takes Aurora to the airlock, and they both put on spacesuits for a spacewalk. Finally, Jim has someone to share this incredible experience with. Out in space, Jim turns off the magnets on their boots, and they float together, enjoying the beauty of the cosmos. When they return inside the ship, they share a passionate kiss and retreat to his cabin to be together. Soon after, they begin living as a couple. Aurora moves into Jim's cabin and writes about her life on the ship. They do everything together, jogging, eating, sleeping. While Jim explores the ship further, he discovers the hydroponics bay and brings Aurora flowers as a sweet gesture. One day, the ship passes by a red giant, and they visit the observatory to witness the breathtaking sight. It happens to be Aurora's birthday, and they celebrate it in one of the ship's restaurants and later at the bar. In the meantime, Jim prepares a ring he's made for Aurora in the washroom. Unbeknownst to him, while he's away, Arthur shares the truth with Aurora, revealing that Jim woke her intentionally, unaware that he had promised to keep it a secret. When Jim returns, Aurora confronts him, filled with disbelief and anger. She runs away in a state of panic, leaving Jim to find her things gone from his cabin. They run into each other in the cantina the following day, but the moment Jim speaks, Aurora flees once more, consumed by despair. One night, Aurora pays an unexpected visit to Jim's cabin. her emotions running high, and she confronts him with anger and frustration, expressing a desire to blame him for her situation. She vents her frustration by striking out at him physically, wanting to hold him accountable. Jim, attempting to reconcile with Aurora, contacts her through the communication system, as she has been avoiding him. He tries to apologize and offer an explanation for his actions. He takes a brave step in sharing his love for her, but Aurora remains indifferent, unable to forgive him for taking away her planned life. During another evening, a ship malfunction occurs while Jim is in his cabin. The ship faces a critical error, leading to the shutdown of the main command system. Later, as Jim enters an elevator, it malfunctions, raising concerns among the ship's inhabitants. Aurora enters the main concourse and is surprised to find that Jim has planted a tree there, a symbol of hope and resilience. Subsequently, she goes to the cantina, where the food dispensary is also experiencing malfunctions. Suddenly, they both hear the voice of Gus Mancuso, the ship's deck chief, over the comms, inquiring about the tree. Both Jim and Aurora rush to the concourse and find Gus standing in front of Jim's tree. They introduce themselves and inform the chief about the ongoing situation. Confused by how 3 pods could fail, Mancuso takes them to the ship's bridge, realizing that there is a problem with the ship's systems that requires manual inspection. Upon leaving the bridge, a robot nearly falls on them, and they inform Mancuso about the increasingly frequent malfunctions occurring throughout the ship. The chief is concerned that this shouldn't be happening and shows them how to collect data. While examining the pods, Jim joins Mancuso and explains what he has discovered about Aurora's pod. The deck chief is shocked by the gravity of Jim's actions. Later, Mancuso is on the bridge, examining the data they've collected when Aurora joins him. They discuss what happened with her pod, but Mancuso regrets that there's nothing he can do to rectify it. During their conversation, Jim enters the room with the 16th malfunctioning robot. Mancuso, showing signs of hibernation sickness, decides to rest and exits, but as he leaves, he coughs up blood. That night, Aurora struggles to sleep, so she decides to go for a swim. Suddenly, gravity is lost throughout the ship, and she begins to drown as the water from the pool moves uncontrollably. The gravity drive resets just in time, and she barely escapes alive. While heading to find Mancuso, they cross paths with each other. All 3 of them end up back at the bridge, gradually piecing together what has been transpiring with the ship. Mancuso deduces that something occurred 2 years ago, damaging a major system. They realize that they must locate and repair the issue because the entire ship is overcompensating for the malfunction. If they don't fix it, the entire vessel will become stranded. In pursuit of the problem, Mancuso suddenly collapses. Jim and Aurora rush him to the infirmary, where they discover that he is dying, and there are no available treatments to prolong his life. Sometime later, the 3 of them gather in the observatory. Mancuso entrusts Jim with his ID bracelet, urging them to repair the ship before he passes away. Suddenly, the ship's lights shift to a foreboding red, and the vessel begins to tremble. Jim implores Aurora for her assistance, and they hurry toward engineering. However, another failure in the gravity drive occurs immediately, followed by another one that affects Arthur as well. Jim deactivates the android. They finally reach engineering and begin their search for the problem. Inside the power plant, they discover the issue, but as they open the hatch, a sudden vacuum pulls Aurora into the breach, caused by the asteroid's impact on the hull. Jim, too, gets caught in the force, but manages to hold on to the hatch, which threatens to close on him. Eventually, they both get sucked in, but they act swiftly to seal the breach. Immediately after rectifying the first problem, Jim realizes that there are multiple breaches in the hull. They trace the meteor's path and find that it struck the reactor control computer. Jim believes he can locate replacement parts for it. After finding the necessary component and installing it, they encounter a failure in manually venting the reactor. Jim concludes that they must open the vent door from outside the ship to cool the reactor. Both of them prepare for the dangerous task at the airlock, where Jim hands Aurora Mancuso's bracelet, understanding the risks he faces. She assists him in donning the spacesuit, and as he steps into the airlock, she pleads with him to return, unable to imagine life on the ship without him. Back at the reactor, the temperature has reached critical levels. Aurora is struck by a bolt from the reactor as Jim approaches the vent door from the outside. The temperature continues to rise in the reactor room, and Jim attempts to bypass the vent door to open it manually. Realizing he must hold the door open for the reactor, they engage in a heartfelt argument, with Aurora expressing her fear of losing him, but Jim insists they must save the other people on the ship. Aurora eventually proceeds with venting the reactor. The process is successful, but the fumes from the reactor propel Jim away and sever his tether. His suit's pressure begins to drop. Jim communicates the dire situation to Aurora, who rushes to secure another spacesuit to rescue him. He offers his apologies once more. Aurora swiftly dons a suit and ventures out to retrieve Jim. However, her tether falls short, causing her to be pulled back toward the ship. In a pivotal moment, she manages to grasp Jim's tether and successfully pulls him to safety. Aurora hauls Jim into the infirmary, but upon examination, she fears that he may already be deceased. To her relief, she uses Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical protocols and initiates the process of resuscitating him. The medical pod takes over the revival process, ultimately bringing Jim back to life. Aurora forgives him for his actions. Later, Aurora repairs Arthur, and they conduct a proper space burial for Mancuso. Jim takes her to the infirmary and reveals that he has devised a method to utilize the medical pod for hibernation. He suggests that she enter the pod and endure the remainder of the journey in suspended animation. However, a surprising revelation unfolds as she declines this offer, choosing to remain awake on the ship. Jim eventually proposes to her, and they live out their lives together on the ship. 88 years later, the Avalon finally arrives at Homestead 2. The crew awakens to discover the ship in an unexpected state. Aurora leaves them a message, recounting the life she and Jim shared on the ship while the rest were in hibernation. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay connected with us.